Hey guys, the following is from Chad Channing about Nirvana. Quote, one of the memories that stick out to me from my time with Nirvana is that I like the fact when we were starting out, we drove this small snub-nosed Dodge van, and it was just the three of us, myself, Kurt, and Krist. Sometimes we'd have a sound guy with us, but mostly it was just us three, or sometimes we'd travel with Jason Everman for a while who played with us. In any case, it was kind of a challenge, but I enjoyed it. Like, when we first started out, we'd play a show and we'd be wondering if we'd make enough money for gas to get to the next show. So it was very touch and go at first. One time, and this is kind of a funny one for me, we were driving through Montana, which it takes a long time to drive through that state. I was driving and I was kind of bored, so I decided to drive with my teeth. So I have my teeth on the steering wheel and I'm just driving like that. I've been doing that for a long time, and then Chris woke up and looked at me like, "What are you doing? Don't drive with your teeth." I said, okay, but I didn't have the heart to tell him that I've been doing that for almost 2 hours. It was a good feeling to do our own thing. We didn't really have anybody else but ourselves. There wasn't like a tour manager with us or anything, so we were kind of just on the road, following our noses as we go. I don't know, something about just seeing places and going different places to play. I've always just loved that. It was a lot of fun doing that with those guys. As far as any low point goes, we had this show in New York. They had a rubber mat in this club instead of a carpet for the drums. And so during the show, the kick drum kept sliding and sliding and sliding. And I was constantly during the songs just trying to grab it and pull it forward, grab it and pull it forward. And eventually by the last song, Negative Creep, like halfway through it, I got so frustrated that I stopped. I picked up the kick drum over my head and just slammed it on the stage, which I ended up cracking it, so I had to duct tape it and tape it together because it was only halfway through the tour, so the rest of it we had to do it with a cracked drum set. But yeah, that was a low. I did not like that moment. In terms of things ending with the band, I have no regrets because I've always sort of thought of it that things just sort of fall in place for a reason. For example, maybe I was the perfect puzzle piece for the band at that time, and then they needed another piece to do other things. Our differences are mostly strictly on a musical level. I mean, we always stayed friends. In fact, I remember one of the first times I saw them with Dave at this place called the OK Hotel in Seattle. It was the first time I'd seen the guys in probably a year or so, and it was really good to see them. We were saying, "Hey, how's it going?" So it was really friendly. And I met Dave for the first time too, and found out what a really nice guy Dave is, so it was really nice meeting him too. I hold no regrets, certainly have no ill will. It's just part of the business sometimes, I have no regrets, and I look back at those days and think, wow, I played a small part in something that had a big impact. I'm happy with that. I think that's kind of neat. Now, in terms of when I first met the guys, I first met Kurt and Krist at a Malfunction show. They were playing the Community World Theater in Tacoma. I went there, and a friend of mine, Damon, introduced me to Kurt and Krist because they were looking for a drummer. Before that, I was in a band called Tick Dolly Row, which had actually featured Ben Shepherd, who, of course, would become part of Soundgarden. In fact, that's how Kurt and Krist heard about me. A friend of mine, John Goodmanson, had this radio show at the college station, and Tick Dolly Row went up there. As I would learn later, Kurt and Krist were listening to that show and thought, wow, that's some pretty cool stuff. The thing that lured me into their band was how simple the music was, yet with the vocal melodies was just really cool. He did a really good job of taking something simple and making it sound really, really good. I remember seeing their show when they were named Bliss. You got this one guy who's really, really tall, just hammering the bass. And then there's Kurt. He had some kind of, it looked like crushed velvet, silk, purple or blue, bell-bottom pants. And I think he was wearing platform shoes. He was a really colorful character up there. He's louder than hell, screaming, and then there's Krist, who's standing the size of the Eiffel Tower on one end. Krist was the talkative one. Kurt seemed on the quiet side, almost timid. Kurt and Krist always had a pretty good relationship. It was like a special little brotherhood sort of thing. Kurt was a quiet character a lot of the time, so if something was bothering him, you'd never know it. And if he talked to anybody about it, it would always be with Krist. Those guys really cared for each other quite a bit. Now, in terms of the band itself, the first time we toured, Bleach hadn't come out yet. We just had the single out, Love Buzz Big Cheese. That was an interesting tour. It was hit or miss. We could end up playing Tucson for 20 people and be lucky to come out of there with $30 to get us enough gas to make it to the next town, where maybe the next town would be a different story. There were these people that would come out. We're on the Sub Pop Singles Club and we know all about you guys. It's like, you do? Now, recording Bleach happened fast. We were in there for I think a week, recording at Reciprocal, a really cool scene. I always remember Jack Endino sitting there and he had a circle of snacks around him, chocolate bars. We did a lot of weird experimenting with snare sounds. We actually took 2 snare drums, took the bottom head off of one of them, and the top head off another, combined the 2 drums together. So there ended up being this gap between the 2 snares, but I used double-sided screws to link them together. Another thing, Blue was a song that initially was played in D. So when we went to record that song, it had turned out that we were already in D and that everyone turned down, or at least Chris did, to C. It was even lower. When Bleach came out and the second tour began, things were definitely a lot different. It was generally packed houses. We spent a lot of time hanging out with people that would come to the show and almost always get hooked up with a place to stay. Some of the most fun places to play were in the Midwest. I think it's just because they didn't get a whole lot of bands coming through there, except for really big major acts at whatever Coliseum. One of the bigger memories was when we played in Dallas, and we got caught in that massive rainstorm. It's on the DVD with the lights out. We ended up staying at somebody's house, but it seemed like there were 10 or 11 people living at this big house. And then we had that show in San Antonio where we didn't end up staying at anybody's place. We ended up camping out. When we were out there, some sort of campground, we woke up and heard these ducks that sounded like they were getting ripped apart. Crazy noise, huge splashing in the water. I think Jason Everman was walking down at night with a flashlight looking around the water trying to see what the heck was going on. We're like, could that have been an alligator? Hell, it's swampland, I wouldn't put it past it. Kurt or Chris might have decided to sleep inside the van after that. Milwaukee is where I think some of the footage on the DVD came from. The Pixel Vision stuff, the really weird black and white grainy small screen stuff. That clip is a time when we were driving down the road at night. We put up a blanket to separate the 2 front seats. Chris was driving and me and Kurt had the Pixel Visions going. Just started doing random things and saying random stuff. I think we were drinking Jim Beam, wine and whiskey. On tour we listened to a lot of artists including Shonen Knife. Those guys hadn't been familiar with Shonen Knife until I brought in a tape. In Boston I picked up The Man Who Sold the World. I know those guys, Kurt anyway, weren't big David Bowie fans. But I popped it in one time and Kurt was like, wow, this is really cool. This is David Bowie? I'm pretty sure that's where he got the idea of doing The Man Who Sold the World. Touring definitely had its ups and downs. I think Kurt having that onstage freakout was in Italy. I guess he was questioning the whole band thing and everything else. My perspective on it is kind of a lot different because pretty much after I was born, I've spent most of my time moving. I've moved so many times it's ridiculous, so I'm very accustomed to being on the road. When I'm touring, I'm completely comfortable and happy when I'm out of my element. I may have been the only one on that entire tour that enjoyed myself all the time. I know it was tough. The other guys would complain of being sick of eating bread and bologna spread. Including Tad, who came with us to Europe, there were 9 of us in this passenger van, so we were all in pretty close quarters. When Jason Everman joined the band, the idea that Kurt was thinking was, I'd like to get somebody in there so I don't always have to worry about trying to keep that rhythm up, or if I mess up, there's someone to back me up. So I've got that freedom to concentrate on what I'm singing. We had the one tour with him, and to this day, nobody's really sure, except for Jason himself, what went on. Halfway through the tour, when we got to New York, he got really quiet on us. We tried asking him what was up and never got much response. We had a lot of fun with him until whatever happened changed. Then it got kinda weird. In April of 1990, Kurt, Krist, and myself recorded several songs with Butch Vig in Madison, Wisconsin. Half the songs that came out on 1991's Nevermind were songs we recorded with Butch Vig the previous year. Those April of 1990 recordings with Butch Vig were to be the next album for Sub Pop, but we didn't know at the time, at least I didn't know, that Sub Pop was talking to Geffen. A deal was made that this wouldn't be quite a Sub Pop release and Geffen would take over and put out the album. They ended up doing that, but re-recorded the album. By the time Nirvana re-recorded the album in May and June of 91, I was no longer in the band. Everybody's heard things like, he left or he was fired. It was actually a combination of both. I was hoping to get the opportunity to chip in with some songwriting. After Bleach, Kurt talked about it. He wouldn't mind having some help with writing. And of course, being a songwriter, I was like, I'm all for that. But over time I realized that wasn't going to happen. What slowly happened was I just started losing my inspiration to play. It shows. Ultimately, I didn't give them much choice but to kick me out of the band. You know, when you don't feel like you're being all you can be in a band, it eventually kind of wears you down. And that's what it was ultimately doing to me. It was just kind of dragging me down, and it was like I started feeling like a drum machine more than anything else. Somewhere along the line, I just started losing some of my inspiration. And of course, when you do that, it's going to show. No matter what you're doing, even in the workplace, if someone's not in it, you can tell. And so what do? Well, you gotta get rid of them. And so Krist and Kurt made the long drive up and came to my place to let me know. It was a weird drive for them. I remember talking about it with Krist years down the road. It was like, yeah, that was a real horrible drive. Me and Kurt were not looking forward to that at all. Because the thing was that we were always good friends, so when I say that it was due to musical differences, that's exactly what it was. That was the deal. Part of me thinks, maybe at some point I should have voiced my opinion about what I wanted to do and seen where that would have taken me. But I don't know, for whatever reason, I didn't do that. In any case, the conversation that day with Kurt and Krist when they came to my place was kind of brief, actually. They kind of opened up and basically said that it doesn't seem like lately I've been giving it my all. And I actually agreed because I wasn't. I was kind of burning out on it. It was like, yeah, that's true. I told them that I completely understand your guys' decision on this. I think part of it too was the fact that when we were recording in Madison, Wisconsin with Butch Vig in April of 1990 for what was supposed to be the second Sub Pop record, those were the same times that Sub Pop had been talking to Geffen. And so when we found that out too, that was a big stepping stone. So I think on both sides of the water, Kurt and Krist were like, wow, we got to figure out what to do here because we were about to jump up to hopefully a bigger level. And for me, it was almost crunch time for myself. It was like, well, I got to figure this out. How should I tell them that maybe I shouldn't play with you guys anymore? I don't know. It was weird. I mean, part of me totally wanted to go on because it's music. I liked it. It's one of those things where I always enjoyed listening to the guys playing, even while I was playing, because I love good vocal melody line stuff, and that's what I thought was so great about Kurt, which was one of the big reasons why I joined the band, because I like that whole mix of melody and guitar he was doing. So I really did like the music we were doing. Part of me did want to continue on, but the realistic side was, I don't know how happy I would be. It's like, sure, I probably would have had a few more dollars in the billfold, but would I be doing my own thing? Would I be doing, music that's more with me involved in it? Probably not. Even though Kurt mentioned that he was looking to do that at one point, realizing that wasn't going to happen, I was pretty certain that wasn't going to happen, at all. Ever. I actually didn't even talk about that, though, with Kurt that day at my place. Part of me was like, let's just get this over with. I kind of let them do most of the talking about the stuff and what was going on, just listening to how they were feeling about it. And I was like, that makes sense. At the same time, I'm not really sure why I just didn't tell my side of the story, so to speak. I never really did. I think it's because maybe part of me was thinking, well, if I did, I don't want to make this more of a hassle or a big deal any more than it has to be. In any case, when it came to the band's first album without me, Nevermind, overall, all the parts on the re-recorded songs were the same. In fact, when I heard that, I was like, wow. I was flattered that they kept my stuff, the things that I had done. Kinda the greatest compliment I've ever received. For instance, in Bloom, I had the single kick drum thing going on for main verses, and then Dave added an extra one. But the majority of that stuff is all pretty much the same. In 1992, when Incesticide was being put together, I was never actually contacted by Kurt or Krist during that time. Just by Nirvana's lawyer. I had heard I was going to have 3 tracks on the album, Dive, Stain, and Big Long Now. A lot of that stuff I had heard before because it was from the demo they had made with Dale, the demo they gave to me just before I joined up. I'd never heard the cover tunes before, so that was pretty cool. I was surprised to see Big Long Now in the list. That was a song that I had thought might never get released. That was a song I actually named, like About a Girl. And Stain was taken from the recordings at Soundhouse with Steve Fisk. There were a number of cool songs from that session which ended up on the Lights Out stuff, like Token Eastern Song. Kurt was a really interesting guy. Sometimes he just beat the heck out of himself, out of his chest, like he was trying to dislodge phlegm. Every now and then he'd talk about it. He'd be like, I don't know what it is, it's just sometimes it feels like it's overcongested. Kurt definitely kept to himself a lot. He was more open with Krist about things, but once in a while I'd be surprised. We'd talk about things that were more of an intimate kind of subject. I always liked Kurt. I wish I had at least one more opportunity to talk to him. Never had that opportunity. I think Nirvana's music stands up pretty well. It definitely shows a testament to how rapidly a change in music can happen. One kind of music is really popular and then bam, some band comes around and it's completely changed music. It wouldn't surprise me if Nirvana albums were being bought for years to come. I look at some of the greatest bands around. The Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, they're bands that will always sell. To me, it's hard to imagine a day where nobody will ever buy another Stones album. I think it's possible that Nirvana may end up in a similar thing, where people will always be buying Nirvana records for as long as music is music. I was always a fan of Swap Meet. It's probably my favorite song from Bleach. I also like playing Sifting. Those were probably a couple of my favorites off the record. When we were making that album, I don't think any of us thought we were making something special at that time. We didn't have the objective to get huge or anything. We were just playing music because we wanted to do it. We just wanted to do our kind of music. When we recorded the record, we had no expectations of how many copies it would even sell. So we didn't have a lot of high expectations for ourselves. We were just glad that we were doing exactly what we want to do, because it was always like, well, it seems like record companies or whatever get a tight hold on bands and stuff. You worry about losing your inner artistry, I suppose. I think we got pretty lucky to make Bleach for only $600. I know that the very next time I made a record, it cost a lot more than that, so it's kind of a rare thing. I think it's just one of those things that you never really know when you go into the studio and record. I guess it was just the magic was there that week. It only took us just a little over a week to record the record. I look back on it now and think, wow, how did we ever do that? I've had people come up to me and tell me about how their father, for instance, was a really huge fan and he probably turned them onto Bleach. And it's great because I would never have guessed 30 years ago that Nirvana would still be relevant. And so when that happens and people come up and say, this album changed my dad's life and it's a great record, it's kind of a wow sort of feeling. Music is always about connecting and reaching out to people and sharing. And so the important thing to me is that Nirvana did that. It's great to know that Nirvana had such an effect that so many people enjoyed listening to the band and still do to this day. I really love that. It's taught me that you never really know what can happen in your life. If you work hard at something and persevere, you never know what's going to happen. Nirvana's continued success has shown me that music is everlasting and will just continue to go long after I leave this earth. And maybe one day there can be another band that comes around and changes the whole scene of music again. Never say never. Again, when it comes to early Nirvana, when we first started touring, our goal was to be able to make enough money to get enough gas to get to the next venue to play. But it was surprising. I remember thinking, these people were showing up and were like, hey man, that single's really awesome and all this stuff. The Love Buzz Big Cheese single. I remember even hanging out inside the clubs before they were open. People would be going by and be like, hey, is Nirvana playing tonight? And I'd be like, maybe on the other side of the door or something. And I'd be like, wow. That's really weird. It's like we're here somewhere in the Midwest and somebody actually knows who we are. That's really strange. That's pretty much what the single and the tour was like, but when Bleach came out, it was a totally different story. It was like everywhere we played, people knew who we were. And all the venues we played were just packed with people. And it was kind of a rush. It was like, wow, this is so wild. I mean, before we had some packed shows, we had a lot of shows that didn't have a lot of people as well, but this time around was totally different. The Bleach record was totally different. The shows were a blast. The shows were a lot of fun. It's something I'll always hold on to as some of the best times of my life. In terms of Kurt's death, I think the thing to me was, I think it was just kind of like, almost like being robbed. There were just certain things that I kind of wanted to say, things that I would have liked to have talked with him about. Not necessarily anything specific, just that we hadn't talked in a while, and I realized that was gone. That was the hardest part for me, that it was just gone. The opportunity wasn't even going to happen anymore. There was just something that I just sort of felt being in the band. I knew Kurt had something that was really unique and cool that was going to come out eventually at some point. I think the big question was when. It took me a long time after Nevermind came out where it sunk in that, gosh, this band is actually getting pretty big. I became a really big Nirvana fan when I first heard the recordings of Nevermind. I was really excited for those guys. It was really, really cool. Looking back on the April 1990 sessions with Butch Vig, the sessions which were the precursors to Nevermind, everybody appeared to be pretty comfortable working with Butch Vig. Every time we'd go into the studio, Kurt and Krist always had a certain agenda or something in mind. I was never really one to be upfront with putting out ideas and stuff like that. I was always a little bit more in the background. I think they were happy with the end result recordings. I think we all were. As I recall, when they were working on Nevermind in 1991, Kurt originally wanted to keep the songs they had already recorded in Madison to put on the record. But Geffen Records apparently wanted to redo the whole thing. I guess what they were looking for, being a major label, was something as polished as they could get from the band. So in order to do that, consistency in sound and recording is probably everything. They probably felt it would sound too inconsistent sound-wise, like, oh, you can definitely tell us from a different recording. I liked In Bloom the first time I heard it. Before we left on that tour in 1990, we had a rehearsal space in Seattle, and Kurt had started playing that song. Obviously, he had worked it out with Krist a little bit, and I jumped right in with what seemed totally natural. What I actually ended up playing on the recording was exactly what I did the first time I ever heard the song. So it's one of those songs where, for me, it just gelled instantly. Kurt never really talked about his lyrics much or what they were even about. I remember once the only thing about him ever talking about lyrics, we were in this hotel room. And he's like, I'm trying to come up with some lyrics. Anything that rhymes with this and rhymes with that, whatever words, just throw them out. It was sort of a grab bag of ideas, just spewing out words. Apart from that, he was always quiet about it, so I'm not really sure. I remember back in 2000 or something, when someone alerted me that I actually had a song on Nevermind, and I was thinking, I do? What the heck song is that? Then I found out it was Polly. I gave it a listen and I remember now. There was a small little room in the studio and it was big enough for just 2 people and an amp. It was pretty small. They put me in that room with my ride cymbal. So it was just me and my ride cymbal, and I listened to this song. Every time that one little cue part or break came up, I hit the ride cymbal. So I hit it like 4 times, which is all it required, the entire song. And then that was that. It was the actual recording which ended up on the record. It was the one song I guess Kurt had said, no, I definitely do not want to redo this. And I guess they figured it doesn't have a whole lot to it, there's only a little bit of drums. Another song I liked was Lithium. In all, I was really grooving on all the new stuff. In fact, much of this stuff was so new that I was learning and adapting to the song, the parts and the things I wanted to play as the tour went on. Many of the songs we recorded were songs that we didn't have a whole lot of opportunity to play together as a band and rehearse before we went out on that tour. I'm sure Kurt and Krist played out the songs, but before we left for the tour, for the majority of the songs, we maybe had 1 or 2 rehearsals. But by the end, when we got into the studio, I was pretty comfortable with what I was doing. And really, pretty much like In Bloom, a lot of those songs, they just sat right in. A lot of it fell into place really easily. As mentioned before, I definitely took it as a compliment that Dave replicated many of my original drum parts when they recorded Nevermind. But most of them are so minuscule that people comparing the records, unless they were hardcore music buffs, I think the average listener wouldn't even notice that much. The most notable change of any of them was In Bloom. On the main verses of the song, I would just use a single kick thing, and Dave threw in an extra kick. And everything else on that is pretty much identical. And then with Breed 2, there's just one part where he began a drum roll fill just a half measure sooner than I did mine. Everything else aside from that is the same. Like I said, very minor changes that most people might not notice. I thought it was totally cool. I was very honored that he did that. The first time I heard that record, Nevermind, Ben Shepard, my ex-bandmate from one of my previous bands, Soundgarden's bassist, came over. Actually, I went over to his place. He had a recording on cassette. He said, "This is Nirvana's new record. You should check it out. It comes out next month," or something. He has somehow gotten a copy of it before its release. When I heard it, I was like, oh man, this is freaking killer. I loved it right off the bat. It's one of those things where, again, I actually became a Nirvana fan when I was no longer in the band. When you're inside of it, it's a little different. It's work and it's all this kind of stuff. It was kind of refreshing to be able to kick back and go, okay, I can totally listen to it. Because anytime I hear my own music, I always get in this critic mode. I can't really relax and hear it for what it is. When I heard that record though, I was like, wow. 1, I really liked the record and thought the songs were great. And 2, I was like, okay, I can really get into it. And it was nice to know that it wasn't me I was having to listen to. I think Kurt was a great songwriter because it's not easy to take something simple and make it sound interesting. If you can put together a song that has 3 or 4 chord changes in it and keep people interested, that's a trick. It's a trick to make things simple sound good. And one of his best qualities was his writing. And just not musically, but vocally as well. He had great vocal melody ideas. And that to me is key in any good songwriting. You can have a really cool sounding song, but you also need a really good vocal melody. He was really good at coming up with that sort of stuff in Nirvana. Another thing I liked about his songwriting is he would say what he had to say, and if the song went on longer and he didn't have any more lyrics to it, he wouldn't push it and try to think of more stuff to sing. He'd just repeat what he'd written, which is exactly what I've always done. I think Kurt was a lot of time just thinking about things that rhyme. There was one time where we were on tour and he was writing some lyrics. I can't remember what song he might have been writing lyrics to at the time. He just looked up and said, "Hey, what rhymes with monkey?" Just looking for some rhyme to fit in. It was like putting the little pieces of a puzzle together. I know he had an objective of what he was trying to say, but he had a very abstract way of saying it. And whether the lyrics actually made sense to anybody else or not, I don't know if that really mattered to him. Hey guys, I'm going to show you a couple of clips now from my interviews with Jack Endino, Bruce Pavitt, and Steve Fisk, where they talk about Nirvana and Chad Channing. How is Chad as a drummer in general? Did you enjoy working with him?
Oh yeah, he's a great drummer and doesn't get his due. Mm-hmm. He's got a looser kind of, I guess, a hippie feel or something like that. But, I think, he sounded great in Nirvana. I think that version of In Bloom that he did was really, really good. Mm-hmm. Maybe as good as their version with Dave, if you want to just talk about opinions or something like that. But no, I think Chad's an amazing drummer. He's a really good guitar player. He's a songwriter.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, I agree. I feel like Chad really doesn't get the due. I feel like he should have been in the Hall of Fame.
When things get that big, there's all kinds of, shoulda, this or that. Everybody means well.
I wasn't that happy with Chad's drum kit. It didn't record that well. I didn't like the sound all that much. There was a little too much hi-hat bleed on some things.
So you mentioned Chad Channing right now. For me, as a Nirvana fan, I always... first of all, I felt bad that he wasn't inducted to the Hall of Fame. I really felt he should have been. Secondly, I feel like he's kind of overlooked because all the credit to Dave Grohl, he's a monster drummer. He's one of the best drummers out there.
How you compete with Dave Grohl?
Exactly,
I mean, he's everywhere.
Exactly. But I feel like because you're competing with someone who's like Dave Grohl, he kind of gets overlooked. As a drummer, from your experience working with him, was he a good drummer to work with?
Yeah, he was great. He's artistically a very good drummer. He's got a good pop sense. As Dave Grohl has pointed out repeatedly, he was playing a lot of Chad Channing's drum parts on Nevermind because the band had demoed a lot of that material while Chad was still in the band. And Grohl has given credit where it's due to that because a lot of the drum arrangements, as it were from Chad. I think the time when you can really hear Dave Grohl playing Dave Grohl drum parts is in Utero. Mm-hmm. Scentless Apprentice being the best example. That's there's Dave being Dave, Yeah. It starts with a drum pattern that's completely iconic. So, yeah, Chad doesn't get credit, but Chad, he was not as ambitious as Dave, and nobody plays as hard as Dave. I mean, I don't know how his limbs and joints and muscles can withstand that level of intensity, really, because Chad's a pretty good drummer, but Dave is an animal. So, it's just different people doing different things. Chad has played in a number of other projects years later that I have recorded, actually, where the drumming is marvelous, including some of the songwriting, because Chad is actually a songwriter as well. People don't realize that. He has a couple of albums under the name Before Cars that are pretty nice tunes on those records. He's a pretty good singer. He plays bass well. Yeah, different destinies. What are you going to do?
Yeah, for sure. But, thankfully, from what I've seen, various interviews here and there, it seems that the split with Nirvana was amicable.
More or less. I mean, I think they were just going in different directions. I know Chad wanted to contribute some songwriting, and that wasn't going to happen. It's just, whatever. They were after something else. Mm-hmm. Now, they didn't just end up with Dave Grohl initially. They did a tour with Dan Peters. They called up they called up Dale Crover and did a tour with him. So there was a transitional period in there while they were still trying to decide who was going to be in the band. Mm-hmm. So, and they had to sort of check out these other people, and it's like, okay, Dan, well, he's great, but he's not quite what we're looking for. Okay, Dale, he's great, but he's in the Melvins, and I wish I'd seen that tour where they played. I think it was in 1990 where they did a tour with Dale. It would have been interesting to see Dale.
I think it would have been the latter end of the summer of that year.
Probably before they went in the studio with Dave Grohl. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if the latter ended. When did they record Nevermind?
They recorded Nevermind in the end of May, early June 91.
Okay, so yeah, it would have been toward the end of 1990 then, probably. Much later, when the deluxe Bleach came out many years later, I reminded Sub Pop that they had a complete live show with Chad Channing on drums recorded at the Pine Street Theater in Portland, and I believe it was from early 1990. And we pulled out the tapes, and I made a mix of that entire show, which is essentially on the double vinyl version of the Bleach reissue. That's the second disc. So sometime in 1990, Chad was still playing with them. And then after that, we'd have to talk about the session that I did with Dan Peters on drums, which was just Sliver, one song. And then I think they did a few shows with Dan Peters. The Motorsports Garage here in Seattle gets mentioned. I was not at the show. And then they did some kind of tour with Dale Crover. Again, I don't know the exact dates. I didn't see those shows. And then he joined the band and they recorded Nevermind.
This is an open-ended question. Of all the songs you've recorded with Nirvana, was there any one in particular that you were most satisfied with how it came out, the recording?
Floyd the Barber, probably.
Really?
Yeah.
And if I may ask why?
The drum sound. I wasn't that happy with Chad's drum kit. Dale, on the other hand, had a very, very good drum kit, and he knew how to tune it and play it. I mean, he was an exemplary drummer. Now, Chad is a pretty damn good drummer himself, but Dale is one of the top drummers in the world, in my estimation. And I mean, he's up there. He's a monument. And even in 1988, Dale was an amazing drummer with a very good sounding kit, and he knew how to tune it. So the thing is, if you're recording on 8 tracks, you only have a few channels to use for the drums. So you can't rely on technical trickery to make the drums sound good. You have to get the sound at the source. It has to be a good sounding kit played in a well-balanced manner. And that is what I had with the songs with Dale, is, just 5 or 6 microphones submixed onto 3 or 4 channels. Sounded great because he was a good drummer and he had a very, very good sounding drum kit. So that made my recording sound a lot better than an 8-track recording, because it sounded like I had recorded the drums with some full multi-track, array of microphones and technology, and it was really just a great sounding kit. The drums make a lot of difference. So from a technical angle, I like the way Floyd the Barber and Paper Cuts sound. Also the fact that I was allowed to remix those specifically for the Bleach record, rather than using the original rough mixes we had made on January 23rd, which is what went on the Incesticide record, was those original mixes that took about 10 minutes each. Floyd the Barber was originally part of those sessions, as was Paper Cuts, but those 2 songs are not on Incesticide. They were on Bleach from the get-go, but I was allowed to mix them more deliberately because it was part of the Bleach sessions. Like, at the time we were doing Bleach, I think they actually did a version of Floyd the Barber with Chad and decided not to use it because we all, even Chad, we agreed, like, no, we can't beat the version with Dale Crover on it. Let's just use that one. And Paper Cuts, I don't know if they ever even played that with Chad. They didn't try and record that. They just said, now we'll just use the Dale version of that one too. So I had a chance, and I'm pretty sure that Kurt added a backing vocal to Paper Cuts during the Bleach sessions. There's a harmony on it, yeah. And so then I, mixed it again from there. So those were, as we were doing Bleach, the plan was to borrow those 2 songs. Now, Beeswax got added later. It didn't get remixed. It's just the straight-up mix from January 23rd, as far as I remember. It might be a different mix than the one that's on Incesticide. You'd have to compare them side by side in order to tell. And since they were mastered at different times by different people, who knows? Plus one is probably from a backup safety copy and one probably isn't. Who knows about that either? I don't know.
What was Chad Channing like? You know, he's such an important member of that band, but unfortunately he gets overlooked sometimes. What was he like to work with?
He was a little bit like Kurt. He was both Kurt and Chad were very soft-spoken, okay? Sensitive, soft-spoken creative types, for sure. Krist Novoselic was the exact opposite of that, which created a kind of an interesting dynamic. If you were backstage, Chris was the one who was bouncing up and down on the couch, and both Chad and Kurt were way more laid back. So, you know, ultimately it didn't work out for Chad, but he's a really sweet guy and super nice. One of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. And he and Kurt, I thought, complemented each other very well as personalities. That was my take.
Yeah, and, you know, often, I mean, obviously Dave Grohl is one of the most, you know, famous drummers in rock and roll history, right? He's one of the best ones out there. But I also feel like Chad is still a good drummer. I just feel like he gets totally overshadowed because of the Dave thing. You know what I mean? I feel bad for the guy a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. And Chad, you know, I'm just going to scale back a little bit, and you had asked me, hey, when did you really feel that Nirvana was turning around? You know, initially we heard him, it wasn't with Chad. I think they're so. I remember the first show that Chad played, there was definitely a marked difference. A year later, you know, a year after that kind of debut in spring of 88, which would be like spring of 89, they released Bleach at this huge showcase that we set up, Tad Nirvana Mudhoney in Seattle. Bleach came out. By that time, their shows were really coming together. And if you check out any of the in-store shows or Google any of the shows from that period on, you're going to see them really come together. And Chad had a lot to do with that. I will say that.
One thing you said that stuck out to me is that Chad and Kurt had similar personalities.
Yeah, you know, yes. If you walked into a room and there were two quiet guys in the corner, it would be Chad and Kurt. Kurt was, you know, let's straight up, Kurt was a genius. Kurt was a genius, so he was a very creative person. He had more of a sense of humor. So if you had a conversation with him, it was always interesting. It was philosophical. He was a deep thinker. He was funny, but he was soft-spoken, and so was Chad. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, is they were both somewhat gentle personalities off stage. You know, Kurt could really flip a switch when he got on stage, for sure.
One of the things that's been very interesting for me over the past few years, having had the chance to speak to people like yourself and others who actually knew Nirvana on a personal level, is getting to hear that inside story of the band. So again, having known Nirvana personally, having known Kurt personally, how do you feel about the image of Kurt that's out there, that he's this bigger than life person?
You know, that's rock and roll. You know, that's they used to throw the term rock god around because that's how society would relate to people who could rock a coliseum. And I just think music does not have the same cultural impact as it did 25, 30 years ago. And my belief is that young people are so distracted with social media that music, like going home and listening to a whole album and really feeling it, young people have less and less time for that. They're too easily distracted. So I can't think of, this is one of the reasons why we keep circling back to Nirvana and Cobain, because at that time they had such a huge cultural impact, because Kurt was extremely talented and extremely outspoken, and really, I think it's been harder and harder for somebody to kind of step in and do that, in part because music isn't as central to people's lives as it was at that time. If you spend two hours a day on Facebook, that's 2 hours less than you're spending listening to music.
Yeah, it's definitely a different landscape now. And so with that said, do you think it's possible for there to be a new underground band like Nirvana that could possibly go super viral, and not just go viral, but hold that popularity long term?
I'm just going to say it's just going to be a lot more difficult for... You know, certainly there's popular artists out there that have millions and millions of Instagram followers and so forth. So I do think there are some artists out there who can kind of command that level of respect and attention. But there's not a lot because, again, people are so distracted. And the rock culture is weaker now than it used to be. You know, that's pretty obvious. You look at the charts, what's popular. I mean, rock and roll, rock music, guitar music still exists, but it's culturally it's not in the ascendancy.
Do you think it could ever get back up there?
It could. Yes, it could, and there have been some moments, in the 21st century. I look at like a group like the White Stripes, for example, who are just like, wow, they're just a brilliant group, but I think Jack White was is probably as brilliant as Kurt Cobain, but they didn't have the traction that Nirvana did.
In terms of Nirvana's traction, Nirvana, of course, was the focal point of an entire movement. They were the focal point of the grunge explosion. And one of the key places in terms of the history of grunge is, of course, Olympia. I was recently in Olympia for a bit, and when I was there, it did strike me very much as a college town, so it's not surprising to me that a city like Olympia, which has a lot of creative, youthful energy, was one of the key places in terms of grunge's development. In your opinion, do you feel that Olympia's youthfulness contributed to the development of grunge?
Yeah, if you really want to get to the roots of it, I came of age in the punk era of the late 70s in Chicago. I came out to Olympia in 1979 to attend Evergreen State College. And thankfully, Evergreen had one of the most unique radio stations in the country. The station was called Chaos Radio, and it featured and promoted independent music. So that's where I got my schooling on indie music and how I was able to kind of initiate the Sub Pop project, which turned into the Sub Pop Records Corporation and so forth. So in a nutshell, Olympia had quite a history of independent thinkers, and I believe that Kurt really fed off that. In particular, there was a gentleman there by the name of Calvin Johnson, who I've mentioned previously, who I worked with at Chaos, who had started his own label, K Records. He was a singer in this group called Beat Happening. And Kurt was so enamored with Calvin that he tattooed the K Records logo on his arm, just to give you a feel for that. So I think Kurt really fed off the college energy of the town, punks and indie music people in the town.